The half-faced camp remained, standing, unchanged in its original form, but its role had shifted. It was no longer the center. It had become secondary, a structure of the past, still present, but no longer primary. The cabin, incomplete as it was, had taken that place. And within that shift, something else changed. Not only in the environment, but in the perception of it. The forest no longer defined everything. It remained dominant, but it was no longer absolute. There was now a place within it that belonged to them. Not yet secured in law, not yet formalized, but present in fact, built through effort, maintained through persistence, held through presence. It was during this same period, in the early weeks of 1817, a few days before the completion of his 8th year, that an event occurred which Lincoln would carry with him for the rest of his life. His father was away from the cabin. A flock of wild turkeys came near. They did not approach in alarm. They moved within range, visible, present, for a family whose sustenance depended in part on what could be taken from the land. Such an opportunity was not trivial. Lincoln, positioned within the cabin, saw them. A firearm was available. He did not go outside. He pressed the barrel through a crack in the log wall. The decision to act was immediate, not drawn out, not debated. The shot was fired. A turkey fell. The act itself was simple, direct, effective, but what followed was not. The result did not settle into satisfaction. It unsettled. The taking of life, understood as part of necessity, observed as part of daily survival, now carried weight in a different way. Not abstract, but immediate, personal. He would later record this moment in his own words, in the plainest possible terms. He has never since pulled a trigger on any larger game. Those words, written in the third person in his own autobiography, were not a boast. They were a confession, a quiet acknowledgement that the act of killing, even for purpose, even for survival, had introduced something into him that did not resolve easily. He did not hunt large game again, not because he lacked the ability, but because of what that first shot had made him feel. This moment did not define him entirely, but it marked him. It became part of the accumulation, part of the internal formation that ran alongside the external work of clearing land and raising structures. In October of 1817, Thomas Lincoln undertook a journey that could not be made by axe. The land upon which they lived, cleared, worked, occupied, was not yet secured in law. It existed in fact, but not in record. For Thomas Lincoln, this distinction was not abstract. It had shaped his past. It had defined the losses in Kentucky, and it could not be ignored. The nearest point at which such action could be taken was Vincennes, approximately 70 miles distant, through terrain that did not offer direct passage, through conditions that required planning, endurance, and time. He walked the entire distance, going and coming back. The journey was completed on foot, without ceremony, without assistance. When he returned, what he carried with him was not visible in the way that logs or cleared ground were visible. It existed in record, in claim, in recognition. The land office receipt was dated, the entry made, the first payment recorded. The land upon which they lived now held a different status, not only occupied, but acknowledged. The uncertainty that had defined their experience in Kentucky was not entirely eliminated. The full transaction would take years to complete, and in truth, it would never entirely resolve. Thomas Lincoln would ultimately hold title to only a portion of what he had entered. But the foundation upon which their labor rested had been strengthened, something that could not be removed as easily as before had been established. And within that partial stability, the work continued. The forest responded slowly to the seasons. Light increased as branches thinned toward spring. Air moved more freely where underbrush had been cleared. But the density remained. It did not yield easily. Thomas Lincoln's focus did not waver. The cabin, though standing, required completion. Gaps between logs needed sealing. Surfaces needed reinforcing. The structure, if it was to endure, demanded attention beyond its initial raising. Here, the work became more detailed. Less about force, more about finish. Clay was gathered. Grass mixed into it. Applied to the spaces between logs. Pressed, shaped, allowed to set. This process, repeated across the walls, reduced the movement of air through the structure. Within the cabin, Nancy Hanks Lincoln held a different kind of work together. Her role did not lessen as the structure improved. If anything, it became more defined. Within the walls, she maintained continuity, of order, of routine, food required preparation. The space itself required care. These tasks, though less visible than the cutting of trees or the raising of walls, were no less essential. They defined the interior. They made it inhabitable. And within that space, learning continued. Not as formal instruction, not as structured lessons, but as moments. Words spoken, ideas repeated, fragments of reading. The scarcity of books limited what could be accessed, but it did not eliminate the impulse. Lincoln's engagement with words remained active. He listened. He remembered. He returned to what he could. Knowledge accumulated as labor had, by increments, by littles, not tied to a single place, but carried across them. The cabin, though small, became a place where these elements gathered. Work did not cease with the improvement of the structure. The forest still required clearing. The land still demanded effort. But something had shifted in the experience of that work. It was no longer defined solely by immediate necessity. It had begun to include continuity, a sense that what was being built would remain, not only for those present, but for what would follow. As autumn deepened toward the close of 1817, the isolation that had defined their arrival began, slowly, to recede. It did not disappear, but it was interrupted. Travel, though difficult, was not impossible, and those who had remained in Kentucky were not entirely separated by distance alone. Family ties extended beyond state lines, and in time, those ties moved. The arrival, when it came, did not announce itself with certainty. It emerged gradually, figures appearing along the path, movement through the trees, shapes resolving into people. Thomas and Elizabeth Sparrow, relatives of Nancy Hanks Lincoln, the man and woman who had raised her as their own, had made the journey from Kentucky. With them came Dennis Hanks, 17 years old, nearly 18, first cousin once removed to Abraham Lincoln, raised by the Sparrows as part of their household. For Lincoln, Dennis was not simply another member of an expanding group. He was an extension of something specific, a presence that carried memory of what had been left behind. Kentucky, the earlier life, the connections that had not been entirely severed. Dennis was older, louder, full of stories. Through him, the world extended beyond what could be seen from the clearing. This expansion did not come through books. It came through speech, through recollection, through the act of telling. The half-faced camp, which had once held the entire Lincoln family through their first year in Indiana, now found new purpose. It was not dismantled. It was occupied. The Sparrows moved into it. The structure that had once marked survival became, again, a place of living. The cabin and the camp stood together on the same ground. Two forms of dwelling, two stages of the same process, visible at once. For Lincoln, this duality existed not only in structure, but in experience. He had lived within the camp. He now lived within the cabin. He understood both. The transition between them was not theoretical. It was lived. And now, with others occupying the earlier form, that transition became something he could observe from a different position. Within this expanded household, daily life adjusted. Tasks redistributed. Roles adapted. The work of clearing continued. The effort required did not diminish, but it was shared more broadly. Within the cabin, the presence of additional people altered its use. Space, already limited, became more so. Movement required adjustment. But within that compression, something else emerged. Community, not in the abstract sense, but in the immediate reality of shared existence. Voices carried. Stories were told. Experiences compared. Nancy Hanks Lincoln's influence did not diminish with the arrival of others. It extended. Her steady presence, her attention to words, to learning, to what could be preserved and passed, remained at the center of the household. The claim, now entered in record, anchored something. The uncertainty that had driven their departure from Kentucky did not vanish entirely, but it receded. The fear of sudden loss, of labor undone by legal challenge, diminished. For Lincoln, this stability, though not fully understood, formed part of the environment in which he continued to grow. It allowed attention to extend beyond immediate survival, to consider, to observe, to reflect. As the year progressed toward its close, the transformation that had begun with arrival became more visible. The clearing expanded further. The cabin stood complete in its essential form. The camp remained occupied. Paths connected the spaces between. Movement within the land followed patterns that had not existed months before. The forest still surrounded them. still dominant, still vast, but no longer unbroken in the same way. Within it, a place had been made, not imposed entirely, but carved, earned, maintained. For Lincoln, this place was not defined by comfort. It was defined by effort, by persistence, by the accumulation of small acts repeated over time, by the axe work that had shaped the clearing, by the water carried each morning from the spring, by the shot fired through the crack in the log wall, by the weight that shot had left behind, by the words received in fragments and held. All of it present, all of it forming something, not yet visible in full, not yet directed toward any clear future, but present, in the way he observed, in the way he remembered, in the way he responded to the world around him. The height of the eaves, the roof that now stood above him, marked more than the completion of a structure. It marked a threshold, a point at which the life of exposure had given way, however gradually, to the life of enclosure. The forest remained immediately beyond the walls, visible through gaps, audible in the movement of wind through branches. But there was now a boundary, a place that could be entered and left, a place that separated, however modestly, what was within from what was without. The cabin held, the camp held the sparrows, both structures standing on the same ground, one looking forward, one carrying the past. What none of them knew, not Thomas, not Nancy, not the sparrows who had come to begin again as the Lincolns once had, was that the forest was not finished with them. It had one more thing in reserve, something that no cabin wall could keep out, something that moved without sound through the undergrowth, something that the cat-and-clay chimney and the notched log corners and the loft above and the earthen floor below could not stop or slow or turn aside. It was already present in the land around them. They did not yet know its name, but they would.